RED is an international payment processor and fraud prevention services provider. We've actually been working in the payment space for 21 years now. We're a globally recognized brand within that space. We have an international presence and with offices all over the world. We service customers all the way from small, medium enterprises all the way up to blue chip customers. PCI, or Payment Card Initiative, is actually a scheme that's actually been set up by the major card brands, and it's a set of security obligations that companies are required to follow if they hold card information. It was primarily conceived by the card schemes to minimise breaches, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of a lot of the breaches, high-profile breaches that actually have taken place. The industry statistics indicate that these breaches are still actually taking place on a frequent basis. Well, the PCI standard is not a one-off assessment. It is an ongoing, continuous program. The actual assessment differs by the size of retailer. For a small retailer, it could be as simple as filling out a self-assessment questionnaire. At the other end of the scale, for a large-scale retailer, for instance, such as Retail Decisions, you have to engage the services of qualified security assessment organisation, and there is a full on-site audit. The actual PCI audit standard is about 200 items to cover, and each one of those is actually covered by the audit. A lot of retailers are actually looking at the work involved in order to go through PCI compliance, and one of the options is to actually outsource the whole payment processing service. And there are other things that retailers can do, such as tokenization, which actually mitigates the impact of PCI within their organization. Tokenization actually replaces the card number with a token. The token is actually an indirect reference to the card number. If a merchant actually needs to store the card number, they don't store the card number, they store the token. What this does is actually removes those systems from being in scope for a large part of the PCI compliance audit standard. Working with a payment service provider who provides tokenization, for instance RED, will actually have a database that matches tokens to card numbers, and it's RED that will actually maintain that relationship, which obviously means that the merchant doesn't have to store card numbers, and by definition removes himself from a large part of PCI compliance. The new 2.0 standard actually comes into force in January 2012. There have been some minor changes to the standard, largely to try and clarify some of the ambiguities that were in the old standard. The major change is in an element called data discovery, and put simply it's just determining which systems are in scope, which systems are likely to store cardholder data. It's very important for a retailer with multiple systems who may be processing via multiple channels to understand the full scope of PCI to his organisation. The simple answer to that question is unfortunately no. There are a number of reasons for this. Obviously the state of the economy is not ideal. The PCI standard is often seen as very difficult to implement. The PCI auditors very often assess the standard in different ways, which leads to confusion. And on top of that, there is the investment costs and development time for a merchant or retailer to actually implement the PCI standard. A survey in the US recently found that up to 80% of retailers are actually not PCI compliant. Well, PCI compliance is non-negotiable. If there are any breaches, obviously the card schemes will assess fines against those retailers and merchants, but there's a bigger issue, and that's the damage to the brand, the customer trust, and the customer peace of mind. Yes, they are. However, it can actually be difficult for medium-sized merchants who, for instance, have legacy systems to implement the full PCI standards. This is why we're actually seeing a trend towards outsourcing, because that can actually reduce the scope of PCI to merchants and retailers in this position. Yes, we do have an input, but obviously this is part of a much wider process of assessment and input, which includes merchant retailers and also the card schemes. PCI is actually still an emerging standard, and as such it has to be reactive to new technologies and fraud. For example, the use of mobile phones as a payment device, near-field communications, point-to-point encryption standards, and cloud computing, all areas that the PCI Standards Council are actually looking into. The key thing here is, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet for PCI. As long as there are fraudsters out there, there will be a need for PCI. If you'd like more information on outsourcing, tokenization or PCI, please contact us via any of our channels below.